Hi, and welcome to another episode of Tidbits of Preservation. Today with me is Carl Nold, the outgoing president and CEO of Historic New England. Carl, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
So Carl's been at Historic New England for 17 years. You're retiring in June after many great accomplishments. So I thought today, in our short time together, we could talk about the sort of arc of preservation over the course of your career, how things have changed, evolved, and some of the challenges we face today that are new or old challenges we faced for a long time. Does that seem like a good thing to talk about?
Yeah, I think so. Greg, when I started being active in historic preservation, it was in the early 1970s. And the National Trust was not even 25 years old yet. And the National Historic Preservation Act had not even reached 10 years old when I began. So, it was really a very different time in preservation then. My first published article was in Historic Preservation magazine in 1975. It was a student thing leading up to the bicentennial. And that connected me to sort of a wider preservation community than I'd known already. And I attended my first National Trust meeting that year, 75, which happened to be in Boston. A lot of what we know as preservation today, your organization and mine, is really developed since that time in the early 70s. What really got me fired up in those days, in addition to the resources that we were trying to protect and learn about, because American architectural history was not as developed then as it is today, was these people who were passionate. And I remember meeting this woman called Margot Gale. She was from New York. She had an organization called Friends of Cast Iron.
Right.
And she had her own bully pulpit, shall we say, because she wrote for the New York Daily News.
Mm-hmm.
So, here's this woman who, is a tremendous activist. And she really was the classic, a little old lady in tennis shoes. So in those early years, it was almost more, single people who were pushing the agenda in a very personal way. And we didn't have quite the structure of preservation as a national trend as we do today.
It's true. The field really has. We certainly still have some vocal people, but it's a very different field.
The single person focus was also reflected in the focus of preservation work, because a lot of the early work was single building focused, saving this house, saving this city hall, saving, Grand Central Station, you're sitting there at Otis House or with Otis House behind you, and that was still pervasive by the 70s. And it wasn't until things started to shift with some of the battles of the 60s and 70s that we saw a shift to a more community focus. Jane Jacobs, obviously, which we all know about, and her battles in Lower Manhattan, to fight the destruction of neighborhoods. And here in Boston, the Southwest Expressway and people, going to bat to battle that, finally stopping it, not until many things were lost, of course. But, those were the seeds that moved us from that single building focus to where we are today, I think, with a much broader community focus. And it wasn't really until, in the 70s, late 70s, I guess, when the Main Street program came along. And Mary Means created that and really moved preservation, away from the buildings and into the whole environment that we experience.
Well, that's maybe a good segue into sort of some of the evolution you've done at Historic New England and in the work we're doing and some of the, opportunities and challenges we're facing now. I think, you recognize this, but, we're often faced with people who don't realize we've evolved, or, they see it but don't quite get it. And we haven't evolved fully. There's certainly parts of the city that are not well reflected because of that legacy in the historic preservation movement. That the National Register certainly is not reflective of the full population. As you and I have talked about, and many of our supporters know, the rules we have aren't really written very well. What would you say to some folks about what we're doing wrong, or what mistakes of the past do we need to correct?
Well, I think the single building focus had its own challenges. And obviously we did a great thing in saving so many treasures of America. And we have increased their visibility and an understanding of their significance. But most importantly, the media in those days was, Ada Louise Huxtable and Paul Goldberger in the Times talking about preservation and how it fit into the urban fabric. And they weren't always, they were not uncritical of us in preservation. And that was a good thing because it helped us to think through that we can't always be the people saying no. We have to come up with the solutions. And I think that's still a challenge today. So I would say to younger people, it's, take the initiative to find how preservation can be a positive force in your community.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and that's it. Trying to get involved early and not just saying no, but I always tell people if you're going to say no, you have to say no, but and give a reasonable option. What are your thoughts about historic New England? I think is an interesting example, right? So you've got a large number of properties, many related to wealthy white people, although other people worked in them, and I know you've been broadening that story. But there's certainly, I'm sure people out there who have a knee-jerk reaction and don't really know what you're about and just take a quick glance and say, oh, it's fancy buildings for people, that's not me. So how would you respond to people who have that knee-jerk reaction, and what suggestions would you make for new leadership to sort of continue that momentum?
Well, in our centennial year in 2010, we took a big step. We decided not to make the centennial, frankly, about the past, but to make it about the future of the organization and the preservation. And we undertook a program called 100 Years, 100 Communities. And we did a variety of projects, collecting and interpretive projects in 100 different towns around New England. And it was so successful that we continued it. We wanted to continue it because it engaged us with totally new topics. And the new name for the program that's gone on since then is called Everyone's History. And we have worked to very much broaden, to look at the stories of slavery, to look at our Native American connections, to engage with working class housing in ways that we hadn't before. So I think these are ways that we've been able to connect to wider stories and use our properties as a base to reach more diversity, more inclusion. And that certainly is something that is in our genes at the moment and that I want to pass on to my successor to continue. I think one of the things we have to use to do it, though, a very important one, you and I have talked about this, is we need new survey work. We need a better understanding of what's out there. Most of the surveys go back to the 80s, and our concept of what's important in our communities has totally changed, and much for the better. It's much more diverse. It comes up much more close to the current times with contemporary history. And we need to integrate that into the professional side of what we do so that it becomes more important across the board in preservation.
Right. No, thanks for pointing that out. I mean, and we face that battle every day, as you know, which is, people are surprised that someone suddenly considers something historic because they look at the old surveys, and our concept of what's important and what's valuable to us as a culture and a society is very different than, even 30 years ago. So understanding what we have and how it fits the picture. Well, I think we should wrap up. And I do want to say, thank you for your work. And history has evolved thanks to great work by people like you and Historic New England and your other activities. So I thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to work closely with you, and hope you're not a stranger as you're doing things a little more leisurely, but still, I'm sure you'll still be active. So thank you for your time with us today.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. Best wishes to you for continued success at the Preservation Alliance.